Hi guys, welcome back to Econ Time with SK. So grab your notebooks, your favorite cup of coffee, and let's get started. So in this video, we are going to look at one more application of the elasticities of demand and supply combined together. So specifically, we are going to be looking at taxes, okay, and how whether demand is elastic or inelastic affects who pays a greater share of tax, the consumer or the producer. So you will see the word tax incidence being used quite a bit. It refers to the tax burden which is divided between the buyers and the sellers, so the consumers and the producers. So when there is a tax, the burden that the consumer pays is called the consumer burden of tax. And when a tax is imposed, the part of the tax that is paid by the producer is called the producer burden. Okay. Now, tax incidence, this word basically means who pays the share of the tax burden. Okay. And this depends on the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply. Look at how I'm using the word compared, right? So it's basically the implication, if the price elasticity of demand is more than the price elasticity of supply, the implication is going to be different from if the price elasticity of supply is greater than the price elasticity of demand. And that is what we're going to be exploring in the following slides. So before going into who's going to pay a larger share of the tax, it's important that we understand how to identify consumer burden versus producer burden using graphical analysis. So remember what we have learned, that when tax is imposed, your cost of production goes up, which means that supply actually goes down, which means it actually shifts leftwards. So that is exactly what is being shown in this diagram. So we have a case where supply curve is originally at S1, right? And you've got the demand curve. So the equilibrium, let's call it E1. And here the price is 5, let's call it P1. When the supply curve shifts leftwards, it shifts from S1 to S2. Now we are at a new equilibrium, let's call it E2. And now the price is going to be P2, which is $7. And of course, at the new equilibrium, the quantity that is being consumed and sold is going to be Q2. Before we figure out the burden of tax, let's actually understand where the tax shows up in this diagram. So always remember that this vertical distance between the two supply curves, this is actually your tax amount. So here it's written, let's say the tax is $4, then this vertical distance essentially represents the $4 in taxes. Okay, which means that, so if you're looking at this diagram, right, this is the new equilibrium E2. If you were to draw vertically downwards to the old supply curve, this vertical distance is actually $4, the tax. All right. And this new quantity, remember I said this is the quantity that is being the equilibrium quantity now. What is the tax revenue that the government gets? Well, it's going to be this whole region. This price, let me call this P naught. So the tax revenue that the government collects is basically nothing but the tax times the quantity, equilibrium quantity. So this is Q2. And tax, remember I just told you, is this vertical distance here. So that's going to be P2 minus P naught times Q2. So that's the total amount of tax revenue that is going to the government, right? Now the question here is that this tax revenue, part of it is being paid by the consumer, while another part of it is being paid by the producer, right? That's what we learned, is the consumer burden of tax and the producer burden of tax. So now the question we're asking is, what share does the consumer pay and what share does the producer pay? There's a very easy way to figure it out graphically. Before tax, for per unit, the consumer was paying $5. After tax, the consumer is paying $7. So remember, even though tax went up by $4, the consumer is only paying $2, right? So actually, the consumer burden of tax is going to be $2 per unit. And so if you were to calculate it for Q2, the consumer burden is going to be just $2 times Q2. Now, if we were to talk about it more generally, well, this is just P2 minus P1 times Q2. So graphically, we're saying, hey, look, the consumer previously was paying at $5. Now he's paying at $7, which is P2. So per unit, this is the tax he's paying. But because, there are total amount of Q2 amount being bought, so actually the consumer burden of tax, the total share from the government revenue consumers paying is this shaded region. Okay, so this is the consumer burden of tax. Now we come to the producer's burden of tax. So notice that previously, when the producer was calculating his total revenue, he was taking home P1, right? But now he's taking home P0. We're going to call this take home price for producer, just so that it's easy for you to remember. So basically, this is the share of tax that the producer pays. And because Q2 amount is being sold, so per unit, the producer is paying $2. So for Q2, this is the total amount of tax that the producer is paying. Okay? What I'm saying is before tax, producer basically his take home price was whatever was the equilibrium price, P1. After tax, the producer's take home price is P0. He's taking home a lower amount. This means that the producer's burden of tax is going to be this vertical distance, right? This vertical distance, P1 minus P0 times Q2. So this is the producer burden of tax. So in this case, we have a unique scenario where out of the $4 tax per unit, $2 per unit is paid by the consumer and $2 per unit is paid by the producer. This will not always be the case, and that is what we're going to see in upcoming videos as we deal with different elasticities of demand and supply. All right, guys, I shall see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.